And the title of my presentation I'll be talking about is Percussion as Protest. So this came out of a DMA course project, and it was around March 2017. And I don't know if it was maybe the political climate at the time, or maybe just as I get older, I'm kind of more interested in these kind of things. But before conducting any research, I kind of had this generic idea about protest in my mind, about people. It seems like if people were going to accompany themselves with music, it seems like they typically turn to percussion instruments more so than other instruments. And so I wanted to maybe look at some historical examples and see maybe why this is. And so this is what I'll be talking about today. I have come up with a list of reasons as to why maybe people turn to percussion more so than other instruments, and I want to substantiate each of these reasons with different historical examples. And I was so glad to be accepted here because I feel like it fits in very well with the theme of the conference and counterculture as we've discussed it so far. Next slide, please. So these are the reasons I'm going to be talking about today. Some of these are probably quite obvious, hopefully not all of them. But the reasons I'll talk about are the accessibility of percussion instruments, the ease of play and the capacity to vocalize while you play, the portability and volume, the rhythmic or repetitive nature of percussion instruments, and then the cultural significance that drums and percussion play in so many heritage people throughout the world. Yeah, next slide, please. So this first idea, the accessibility of percussion instruments. So percussion has the distinct advantage over other instruments in that anything at all can be picked up, struck together, and turned into a percussion instrument, or some kind of found object, if you want to call it that. So this top picture you see is from Argentina. It's a recent example of a casero lasso protest, or in English that translates to casserole protest. The first one of these was in Chile in 1971, where people were protesting shortages of food under the administration at that time. And so, protesting shortages of food, they symbolically grabbed pots, pans, kitchen utensils to make noise and accompany themselves along with chants to, as I said, symbolically protest rising food costs, shortages of food. I think this is a great illustration of the idea of instrument accessibility because it's a gathering that everyone can participate in due to the accessibility of kitchen utensils as noisemakers or found objects, if you want to call them. So you might argue that you could create some kind of rudimentary string or wind instrument with found objects around your house, but I would say that's probably not as easy. And I would say the overwhelming majority of people who have participated in protests throughout the years have not been musicians. And some of these happen quite spontaneously as well, so you might need to grab something very quickly. Recent example in Montreal 2012. And then I just wanted to mention that we've seen whole genres of music come about due to instrument shortages or restrictions, such as steel band music, a genre most of us know and love, which was a direct result of the banning of drums and percussion after the Cambouis riots in the 1880s. Next slide, please. So the next two ideas, ease of playing and capacity to vocalize. So as I mentioned with the casero lasso protest, not only is there an accessibility that comes with percussion instruments or found objects, but also an ease of play and a capacity to vocalize. And I feel it's worth mentioning because this is not always found in other instruments. So when I say ease of playing, I feel like anyone in the world could, within minutes, I could very quickly teach them to strike something together in some kind of rudimentary rhythm and accompany themselves if they were going to chant something. And that kind of that ease of playing, I don't feel is always quite as accessible with other instruments. Beyond the ease of playing, I think that the ability to immediately convey your message makes a protest all the more recognizable, successful, and meaningful to the ones participating. So I feel a good example of this is the Women's March on Versailles. This was October 5th, 1789. This was shortly after the start of the French Revolution. It began in the marketplaces of Paris where women and men were angry due to shortages of bread and rising costs of food. So they collectively gathered, led by drums, as you can see, and they were chanting bread, chanting food, and they marched the nearly 20 kilometers from Paris to Versailles. So it took them a little over 6 hours to make this march. And I think I think this was an interesting example because you can imagine if they're protesting food shortages, they're probably tired, hungry, in a state of exhaustion, some of them, and this kind of chanting and the drum playing probably helped to create a kind of solidarity amongst them, and the chanting probably helped propel them, to march over 6 hours. It's a good example of this, how this creates a solidarity amongst the participants. So this solidarity has been written about by ethnomusicologist Thomas Torino. He discusses this in his 2008 book, Music as Social Life, where he describes a dichotomy between two kinds of musical performances, participatory and presentational. So in the participatory approach, he writes, the aim is to involve as many people as possible, as intensely as possible. As such, the music must be easy enough for newcomers to join in, and is usually comprised of short forms that are repeated over and over. While the repetitiveness may make the music uninteresting to an outside audience, it adds to the intensity of the performance of the participants. The emphasis is on inclusivity regardless of the player's abilities. So in contrast, he writes about presentational music. He writes, presentational music involves a separation between artist and audience, with musicians performing scripted pieces as they usually do at concerts. The goal of these performances is to entertain the audience, so the emphasis is on showmanship and variability. The performers are not one with the audience as in a participatory performance. Rather, the audience looks at them, and they may even be seen as heroes by some audience members. So I think this is maybe a kind of generic distinction we can make between participatory and presentational at this point, of the kind of spontaneous, rudimentary, mostly non-composed percussion rhythms and music that we've seen historically at protest gatherings. We can kind of put those on the participatory side, and then on the presentational side, maybe more recent examples of things of composed protest music, like some of the music we might play in a concert setting. So just a dichotomy between these two kinds of music. Okay, next slide. So this next idea, this is maybe one of the more obvious ones, but portability. I feel like when trying to get a message across or express unhappiness with one situation, the goal is to reach as many people as possible. So I feel like volume will aid in this, which I will get to shortly, but the ability to be mobile while expressing a message is also very helpful. So the portability aspect of most percussion instruments has to be a deciding factor in their inclusion in protest gatherings. So this picture you see is from the Women's March on Washington. This was January 21st, 2017. It drew over 200,000 protesters to Washington, D.C. in the United States. They were protesting recent remarks made by President Trump that were seen as anti-feminine, anti-LGBTQ. So you can imagine how not only the volume created here in this, as you can see, quite loud, boisterous looking atmosphere, but the ability to move amongst a crowd of over 200,000 people, again, helped to create a solidarity, bring energy to the protest, just help make it all the more successful, being able to move amongst the participants. And I just wanted to draw your attention to an example that I found that I was unfamiliar with, that I thought was interesting. It's actually just 100 years prior to the Women's March, and this was called the Silent Parade. This was a march through the streets of New York City. And I'll read you a New York Times quote. This is the day after the Silent Parade. To the beat of muffled drums, 8,000 African-American men, women, and children marched down Fifth Avenue yesterday in a parade of, quote, silent protest against acts of discrimination and oppression inflicted upon them in this country and in other parts of the world. Without a shout or a cheer, they made their cause known through many banners which they carried, calling attention to, quote, Jim Crowism, segregation, disenfranchisement, and the recent riots of Waco, Memphis, and East St. Louis. So I just thought this was very interesting, especially in contrast to this kind of loud, vivacious atmosphere. Although they chose not to, they accompanied themselves with drums, although they chose not to speak. The drums certainly aided in their protest, but certainly the portability aspect and the ability to march down the streets of New York City helped to make it all the more successful. So volume. So this is maybe one of the more obvious ones. With percussion, obviously more so than most other instruments, we have the ability to be quite loud. So not only that, but with volume also comes the ability to disrupt the workings of people around you, which might be advantageous if you're seeking to stop the actions of a group or organization. So a good example of this is what is called Lafayette Peace Park. This is in Washington, D.C. It's just nearly right outside the White House. It was just right down the street. It was a protest that was ongoing from 1981 to 2016, protesting nuclear weapons, war, and various other topics over the years. It was believed to be the longest-running, uninterrupted protest in U.S. history. So, in January of 1991, just as President George H. Bush was about to invade Iraq, the protest was filled with drummers playing day and night. Bush was quoted to the media as saying, quote, "These damn drums are keeping me up all night long," as the volume of the protest flooded the White House press room and disrupted their press briefings. So this ability to be loud, I just felt it was worth mentioning because it allows you to reach more people, maybe disrupt those around you, and that's just not something that's always attainable with other instruments besides percussion. To look further back into history, some research I did after I originally completed this project, I was reading about how the idea of volume and ringing bells in medieval Europe used to govern and regulate many aspects of everyday life. So in a lot of medieval Europe, towns and villages were centered around bell towers, and they were rung on very strict schedules. They were typically rung to signal the start of the working day, the end of the working day, mass, holidays. And I found just a few. There are quite a lot more that I found, but these are just a few examples where people, if they wanted to gather the townspeople, maybe push back against some kind of aristocracy, commit some kind of revolutionary act, they would actually storm the bell towers of the city and ring the bells at inappropriate times, at times when they weren't usually rung, and that would signal to the townspeople that something's happening, something's wrong, something is not right. Okay. So the repetitive or rhythmic nature of drums and percussion. So there have been numerous studies done to prove the fact that rhythm aids in recall and provides more memorable outcomes. I think it's safe to say if there were a group of drummers maybe outside on the hill playing simple rhythms and chanting for the entirety of the symposium, I think it's safe to say that it would be hard for us to get that message out of our head as we left this place. To cite this idea, this is a quote from Walter Ong. He's a famous philosopher and historian. This book, Orality and Literacy, is quite interesting. It's all about how humans transition from a primarily oral culture to a more literate culture as speech and writing were brought about. But this quote, he writes, "Protracted orally based thought, even when not in formal verse, tends to be highly rhythmic, for rhythm aids recall, even physiologically." To cite one source further, in Noriko Manabe's great book, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, she discusses the ongoing protest in Yokohama, Japan by the group known as the Metropolitan Coalition Against Nukes. This organization was founded in 2011, continually protesting nuclear weapons throughout Japan. She discusses how at first the protests were heavily drum-dominated with little chanting. They also had what they call, quote, sound trucks set up around the city with various rock and rap groups riding around playing on the back of these trucks. Noriko writes that as a more call and response aspect was incorporated, both within the drum groups and within the performing groups, they saw crowds steadily rise, they saw more participation from the crowds, and just a more kind of call and response atmosphere. So I thought this was interesting, and I thought it kind of spoke to what I mentioned earlier of Thomas Torino's idea of participatory demonstrations and how they are typically more inclusive, or the idea of inclusivity is typically more intense, more meaningful for those involved. Okay, next slide, please. And finally, cultural significance. I don't think it's too much of a blanket statement to say drums and percussion play a big part in many cultures, many heritages of people throughout the world. Most likely due to the ancient history of the drum and it being one of the oldest instruments in human history. So I feel that when an individual or cultural group sets to protest and speak out against someone who is doing them wrong or inhibiting their desired way of living, I believe it is their identity as a person that they are fighting for. Therefore, the aspects of their cultural heritage that they find most significant, most pertinent, and most violated will be what they strive to put on display and strive to fight for. So this is a picture from the Standing Rock, South Dakota protest. They were protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline in April of 2016. Eric Mandaway, who's an indigenous filmmaker, activist, and musician, he documented the Standing Rock protest, and he writes, "The intention of protests coincides with advocacy towards living life in a good way." So I feel like when he says living life in a good way, he means living in a way that represents and illuminates those aspects of your culture and heritage that you deem most important. So naturally, if there's an organization or people pushing back against these aspects of your cultural heritage, if you're going to protest this, if you're going to push back against them, then these most important aspects of your culture are what you're going to put on display. Next slide, please. Okay, so I left this slide in here because in a longer form of this presentation, I then go on to compare and contrast these historical examples with more recent examples of composed percussion protest music. So I just left this up. These are just a couple of the pieces I talk about. All of these slides and my discussion of these pieces are at my website. I'm happy to answer any questions. If you are interested in this at all, please feel free to contact me. But just a couple of great examples of recent music protesting something. Okay. So finally, this will be the end of my presentation. Thank you all so much for listening. My plan was to spend the last few minutes of my presentation discussing recent performance at the U.S.-Mexico border wall. But reading the program, I see that Professor Schick's keynote speech is, he will be talking about that, and I'm sure he can speak more in depth about it because he was there and I was not. But I thought it was just kind of a nice poetic way to wrap this presentation up. So I won't speak too much about it. I'll let him do the honors. But just to give you kind of an idea of what it was, this was a recent example or a recent performance of Inuksuk by John Luther Adams, a piece I'm sure most of you are familiar with, typically performed outdoors. Professor Schick set this up to be performed by a group of Mexican percussionists on the Mexican side of the U.S.-Mexico border wall, and by a group of U.S. percussionists on the U.S. side, just south of San Diego. I came across this in a New Yorker article by Alex Ross, very famous music critic Alex Ross. So I won't speak too much about it. I'll let Professor Schick do this, but I just felt that the idea of counterculture, and as we were discussing in the panel yesterday, I think this is a great example of that, and an example of music making as perhaps as some kind of musical statement. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Thank you all so much for listening again. Thanks for being here early. I just want to end with a quote from this New Yorker article by Alex Ross. I thought it was a nice way to end. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day. So this is a quote from the New Yorker article about Inuksuk at the border wall. So in the final minutes, Inuksuk grows quiet again. Thundering drums give way to shimmering triangles and cymbals. There was a faint rumble in the distance. I couldn't quite tell whether it was an American bass drum, a piece of Mexican machinery, or the ocean. The crowd grew quiet too. A sense of peacefulness descended. It was striking in a place charged by so much tension. For a few long moments, the wall seemed to disappear. Thank you all so much.